right. Well, this is an excellent turnout here for the last speaker of the day. Shows how much interest there is and that you're all staying awake, alert, and excited, and have a little more stamina to go to the showcase afterwards. I think we have a great speaker to close out our Tuesday session on fundamentals. A little different aspect of the embedded vision area, but I'm looking forward to hearing Peter Milford. He's the president of Parallel Rules, and another one that's come from far and away to land in this country and help move us forward here. Coming from got his degree from the University of Queensland in Australia. So Parallel Rules is a consulting company specialized in image processing, sensors, algorithms, and real-time control. But the background. Well, first of all, let me tell you about Peter's background. Interesting, has his PhD in astrophysics. But really the topic of this talk comes from his last role as CTO of iFluence. And they were developing eye tracking and eye tracking enabled user interfaces. Very interesting area. The reason he made the change is they were acquired by Google in 2016. Peter's going to be reviewing eye tracking technology and concentrating on camera-based solutions and associated system requirements. And he's going to show how eye interaction technologies complement AR and VR head-mounted displays. So, Peter.
Thanks, Tom. So as we're waiting for the last people to come into the room, I thought I'd do a short audience poll in a moment. When I do, I'll ask everybody to stand up and then gradually get you to sit down as you don't have the required answers. It's a poll, though, so no one's going to be put on the spot. So there's two broad areas that eye tracking is developed for. One that Tom mentioned already is augmented reality and virtual reality, so wearable eye tracking, where the eye tracking technology is attached to your head in some form, typically with cameras looking at your eyes, possibly with some extra illumination. And another broad area, which tends to be called remote eye tracking. Typically, it might be mounted on a computer monitor, looking back at your face. And so as well as figuring out where your eyes are looking, it also needs to figure out where your head is. And so if I can get everybody in the audience to stand up, and of course it's the end of the day, so maybe it'll get your heart racing. And so not everybody in the world has used any type of eye tracking yet. And so typically in an audience like this, some people will have used it at a trade show, maybe once or twice. Some people, particularly in Silicon Valley, might actually be developing eye tracking. So if you've never used eye tracking, even once at a trade show, please sit down. And so it looks to me like maybe a third to half the audience have never used eye tracking. So if you've only used eye tracking perhaps as a developer or maybe used it for one small project, so if you've only used it a little bit, maybe only as a developer, please sit down. And so it looks like maybe 90% of the audience is sat down. So my goal, and everyone else can sit down now, please, although if I haven't met you before, please come and talk to me afterwards. My goal is for maybe a few years from now, when I give a talk like this, everyone will have used eye tracking. It's a challenging problem. It's not yet solved. So first, I'd like to talk just a little bit about eye tracking applications, because again, most of the audience hasn't actually used eye tracking. I'll be talking a little bit about both head-mounted display-based eye tracking and also remote eye tracking, what some potential applications of those are. And because it's late in the day, I'll get a little bit of audience interaction there, hopefully wake people up. Then I'll talk a little bit about the eye, because you need to understand the signal that you're measuring. What features of the eye are you looking at? Why? Why are they interesting features? Why are they difficult to track? And talk just briefly about the history of eye tracking, and then a little bit about how people implement camera-based algorithms in particular for eye tracking, and I'll mention some other approaches in passing. Because my background is more in wearable eye tracking, I'll focus a little bit more on some applications of where you might use eye tracking in a headset, and then review very quickly what the requirements might be on camera sensors and processors in order to implement an eye tracking system. So head-mounted displays are still fairly new to the market. There's some very successful VR headsets, augmented reality headsets, not so much, and wearable displays. Google Glass is always taken out as an example there. And the user interface on Google Glass was a mixture of voice, and people could trigger it accidentally, and swipes on the side of the head. And it wasn't the most friendly to use. Another method people used on Google Glass for wake is lifting your head up, which is parodied here in some of these images. Similarly, the HoloLens, the initial HoloLens, was very much on using hand interaction. And what we found was, if you keep your hand out here to interact, it gets very tiring very quickly. Even with my clicker here, I'm just keeping it down by my side. It's a lot easier to control things like that. So people in practice found these user interfaces to be a little bit difficult to use. And so we spent a lot of work developing eye-based user interfaces for head-mounted displays. So what can you use eyes to control something with in a head-mounted display? So I've listed some things here. These are mainly user interface things. Someone in the audience, another broad category of using eye tracking in headsets is what I call engineering applications. Is there someone in the audience can suggest what a headset engineering application might be?
We use it for evaluating design of future spacecraft.
Okay, so that's a use of eye tracking in, so the answer was, or suggested answer was, using it to help design spacecraft. So that's a human factors study use of eye tracking in something being built. Someone else, another application of eye tracking? So, yes? So sports was another suggestion. So one place that it's used in sports is in what's called expert novice training. So how does a tennis star, where are their eyes looking if they're a star? It turns out it's actually different than where a novice tennis player or maybe a not elite tennis player looks. It turns out it's the same for many other sports. We had a video once of a bicyclist. So a mountain biker who's an expert, they're looking a long way in front of them. They know what's happening. A novice mountain biker is kind of looking down immediately, and you can use that information to help train. Another application, someone in the audience? Yes?
Web design for seeing where people are.
Okay, so web design. So when you're designing a user interface, which parts of it do people actually look for? Are they well separated or are they close together? Do people notice the important information on the page? And so we've just, another one? So quality control, I don't know that one. So tell me about quality control in an industrial environment.
You have different type of actuators, instrumentations, and
Okay, so a complex, training people in a complex machine environment. Okay. So going back to headsets, another application of eye tracking in headsets can be a very simple one. Most headsets are presenting 3D stereo information to the user. One of the important things when you're doing stereo imaging or stereo vision is how far apart are the cameras, or in this case, how far apart are your eyes. That's called the interpupillary distance typically. And so some headsets could benefit from having eye tracking just once. You put the headset on, you measure the user's IPD and turn off the eye tracking. So that's an application in a headset. So for remote eye tracking, so there typically you have some sort of eye tracking technology mounted, say, to a computer monitor, sometimes a tablet, or it could just be on the wall. There's a variety of uses. So today, one of the major uses of that is in assistive technology. So I don't see anyone in this room who's stuck in a wheelchair. There's quite a number of people in the world today who live their lives in a wheelchair, and maybe all they can move is their eyes, but they're fully normal mentally. How would that be for you? How would you communicate if all you could do is move your eyes? There's several diseases, ALS, there are quadriplegics. And so one of the very important uses today that actually is being used is for people who are very severely disabled. They can type with their eyes. They can communicate. They can control things, and that's a very important use. Today, Tobii is one of the leading technology suppliers in that area, and they're one of the leading eye tracking companies today in the world too. Another broad category of use is in safety applications. So when I look around this audience today, I think everyone looks mostly awake. But one of the things you can do is you can monitor people's blink rate and blink durations, and that's a measure that you can use for measuring drowsiness. It's well correlated with drowsiness. Or you could even detect if the person's eyes are closed. And that's potentially very important in a variety of environments, whether in an industrial environment or in a car safety environment. And of course, there's been various attempts in using it on cell phones for detecting that you're looking at the cell phone, detecting on whether you want to page down on the cell phone. Most of them that I've seen haven't been that successful. Is there someone in the audience who says, yes, I love it, I use it all the time? No, I don't see anyone. So that shows how difficult it is to both combine the technology of eye interaction, eye tracking, and a user interface that people actually would like to use. So when you want to measure something, so when you want to do eye tracking, what you're attempting to do is figure out where the person's imaging the environment at high resolution. So let me just jump ahead one. So when you look at somebody's eye, the high resolution portion of the eye is called the retina. And that's much higher resolution than the rest of the imaging sensors in the eye. And so when you say you're looking at something, it's typically your retina that's looking at the information. And it's only about the size, angular size that your thumb is when you hold your thumb out. And you perceive the environment as though you're seeing it high resolution throughout your entire field of view, but you're not. Your brain is interpolating. Your eye's constantly moving around, building a map. So when we talk about eye tracking, we're typically trying to understand the optical system of the eye, where the fovea is looking. And the eye is a complicated camera. It has curved surfaces and lenses that refocus. And it turns out, if you go down the optical axis of those lenses, the high resolution portion of the eye, the fovea, isn't on axis. It's typically about 5 degrees or so off axis. And so it also varies from person to person. That's one of the other challenges in eye tracking. The foveal or the optical axis and the visual axis are not the same. And when you're doing 3D geometry, you're tending to, or eye tracking, you're often detecting signals that are related to the optical axis of the eye. But what you care about is the visual axis. So some of the features on the eye, so most of us are aware of the pupil. So that's the dark portion of the eye in the middle. and that changes diameter as the lighting changes. Of course, as you age, it changes diameter very differently than when you're young. If you look at young people, and they can have much larger pupils. As you age, your pupil tends to not have such a large range of diameters. Around the pupil is the iris, which can be used and is being used actively for identifying people. It turns out that your iris is more unique or as unique as your thumbprint for differentiating between people. And I think it's completely rolled out in India, an iris recognition-based system for recognizing people, over 1 billion people in India. And then surrounding the iris, the white part of your eye is called the sclera. And between the iris and the sclera, that boundary is called the limbus. And so two of the features that are important or can be used amongst others for eye tracking algorithms and eye tracking features are the pupil and the limbus. And above the pupil is the cornea. So it's a curved lens surface that you can get bright specular reflections from. And there's a variety of surfaces there. The bright reflection off the top surface, which you can see an example here, we often call those glints. So the very first eye tracking, of course, wasn't done with cameras. It wasn't done with electrical sensors. It was just done by observation. So somebody in the 1800s sat down and watched someone as they were sitting down reading. And they realized that people's eyes, on average, don't move smoothly. They jump around everywhere, and that's called saccades. And that was initially discovered by just observation. And so the eye moves in several ways. One is saccades, another is called smooth pursuit. So if I track a moving object with my eyes, that's smooth pursuit. When you do a saccade, the eye will move up to 900 degrees per second, which I always round to 1,000 degrees a second, because then you can say it's 1 degree per millisecond. And that's one of the signals you have to measure. So some of the early measurement-based eye tracking was done with a moving piece of film with the reflection off the surface of the eye, which gave you a one-dimensional estimate of the eye movement. Then later on, people wore contact lenses with some sort of magnet or coil in them. I'm not sure I would have wanted to put one of those in my eye. And I always joke that another way is you can put a little nail in your eye and watch how the nail moves. I don't think I want to do that. The eyes, it turns out, end up with an electric potential on them. And so you can use oculography, which is a electric potential measurement technique. And most of my work has been in camera-based eye tracking. And typically you want a camera, infrared illumination, and infrared illumination reflecting off the front surface of the eye, a glint. You can also use it reflecting from other surfaces. And for completeness, I'll just mention a company called Ad Hoc, which is using collimated light reflecting off the surface of the eye. Collimated light, it has the advantage that you can construct a 3D model a little bit easier than with uncollimated infrared light. And typically people use infrared for camera-based eye tracking, because if you use white light like this, it's a little bit hard to see what else is going on in the world. Infrared, if you use 850 nanometers, typically an 850 nanometer LED is a fairly low-cost item, and it'll have fairly large tails, and some people can see some of the tails as red. So somewhere between 850 and 940 nanometers, where the camera efficiency starts dropping off, is a reasonable range. So I mentioned already reflections off the front surface. That's one of a class of reflection surfaces in the eye. As a group, they're called Purkinje images. If you have some illumination in the room, your eye looks dark. Your pupil looks dark or black, and sometimes the contrast can be low, so it can be a little bit hard to detect. So one thing people do is, just like when you have a camera flash that's lined up with the camera lens, you can get a reflection off the back of the retina. So in photography, it's called red eye, and in eye tracking, it tends to be called bright pupil. And so you can alternate between a camera image with bright pupil and dark pupil. And just out of interest, this is a simulation showing a bright pupil image, and the camera is well aligned, camera and illuminator is well aligned with one of the eyes and not so well with the other. Being able to simulate eyes is very important when you're developing technologies like eye tracking, because you don't always know your algorithm's working. You don't always know what the configuration that's going to work best. So, for example, in this example, we could move around the illuminator and the camera to get the best signal between the two. I mentioned already glints, so they're often a source of 3D geometry information, which I'll talk just a little bit about later. But they tend to be infrared illuminators placed at known locations relative to the camera. And the known locations is key. So there's a pose calibration that's a very important part of geometric-based eye tracking. And I already mentioned some camera-based. So two broad algorithmic approaches, geometric algorithm approaches, and I see a lot of people closer to my age in the audience. So we grew up with algorithmic solutions, not neural net, deep learning-based solutions. And you can go a long way in eye tracking with geometric-based algorithms. You also need things like calibration of the camera, calibration of the IR illuminators. It's a complex system. So here's a sample showing what an eye with an overlay of a fit ellipse to the pupil and some labeled glint reflections. So the ellipse fitting is more challenging than one would think it should be. So first of all, you're looking at a pupil through a curved lens surface, the cornea. Everyone's cornea is a little bit different as well, remember that. The diameter of the pupil is going to change. As the eye rotates, it'll be looking through a different portion of, the camera will be looking through a different portion of the cornea. As the diameter changes, it will be as well. So one of the main geometric algorithms is an algorithm called pupil center, cornea center. Is this clock correct? It says I have 2 minutes and something. Okay. So one of the references in the resource section has quite a lot of detail on pupil center, cornea center algorithm. It's important because one of the problems, if you just take a picture of somebody's eye and say, where are they looking? How accurately would you like to know that? What happens if the camera moves relative to the eye? Will the eye look the same? Will you be able to determine where the person's looking? So one of the problems to solve in eye tracking is called remount or slip compensation. So what happens if I put on a headset with eye tracking and take it off and put it back on in a different location? Will it still track my eyes accurately relative to the display that I'm wearing? Or if you're standing in front of a computer monitor and you step to the side, will you be able to track where your eyes are looking on the computer monitor accurately? And so to solve that problem, one solution is to always track 2 locations on the eye or in the eye in 3D camera coordinates. So that allows you to form a vector and project the vector to where it intersects with the display, also in a known location in in camera coordinate system. So one of the things people often say or feel is that eye tracking's easy, that it's solved. Just put some eye tracking on this headset and we'll come back in a week. But it turns out that the requirements on accuracy are very stringent on building an accurate eye tracking system. So here's a simple error calculation going from a cornea center to a pupil center. So those are two good locations to use if you're going to use a two-point geometric approach. And it concludes that if you displace one of those by 7 microns, that's about a 0.1 degree error. And there's a large number of items that you have to control the tolerance on in a system like this. So the camera lens distortion, along with the camera intrinsics, the LED pose. So if you have infrared illuminators, you want to know where they are as well to high accuracy in order to maintain. If you're targeting, say, 1 degree accuracy on the headset, how many 0.1 degree errors can you have in the system? The display pose, so where's the display in camera coordinates? When you're measuring the location of a glint on a cornea, how many pixels does it cover? Where's the peak of that? How does that relate to the shape of the LED that produced it? Those are all issues to consider if you want to target something like a degree of accuracy. So a completely different approach is a deep learning approach. And of course, one of the challenges in deep learning, and this is from a paper that's, this architecture is in a paper that's referenced in the resource section of the talk. One of the challenges in deep learning is getting representative data from many subjects. So one approach is you get a lot of subjects. And of course, today, that's a real challenge with data privacy and security. Iris images, as I mentioned before, are very unique. And so a lot of people don't want their irises stored in somebody's database as personally identifiable information. So in this paper, they did a really good job. They used cell phones for data collection and gamified it or something. And they came up with a average error over something like 1,400 subjects of about 1.5 degrees. Of course, if you want to develop a product around that, for a consumer product, you don't target the average. You target something more like 3 sigma away from the average. So I'm not sure what the standard deviation on their measurement was. And then there was also a little footnote in their paper, which I don't want to pick on them because it's very common, this type of footnote. It says, oh, and we discarded 40% of the data because it kind of wasn't what we wanted, or it didn't work, or there was some missing information. And I don't know how that would translate into a real world application. If you look at your cell phone and 40% of the information, 40% of the time it doesn't track, I don't think that's a good product. So maybe that's what our cell phone-based eye tracking systems are doing. So here's some examples of some of the corner cases that you get in eye tracking. So the leftmost one, it's not very common. So if you are actually developing algorithms, you might say, I'm going to ignore that. And the big ones are the occluded pupils, eyelashes over the pupil. It's just challenging. So one of the applications of eye tracking in VR is solving what's called the accommodation divergence problem. So when you're using a headset, your eye lens is focused at a fixed distance matching the headset's fixed distance, which is typically about 2 meters. But if you want to put 3D content in close, your eyes swivel closer together, so that the content that you've displayed on the 3D display, say, is at 30 centimeters, and your eyes verge in like this. And a lot of people get headaches because your eye lens says it's at 2 meters, and your Vergent says it's only at 30 centimeters. So what sort of camera do you need? It's probably of the order of a QVGA camera. Frame rate, I mentioned one application where it was one when you put it on. For foveated rendering, which I skipped over, you probably need 100 hertz or 200 hertz, although we had some good results at lower rates. I personally think any machine vision application should be using a global shutter camera that avoids motion blur. For eye tracking in particular, the illumination only needs to be turned on when you're exposing. So with a short exposure, your eye is safer with a lower flux of infrared. For geometric algorithms, it's of the order of 30 MIPS per image, and that's just a very ballpark number. And for deep learning algorithms, over 1 or 2 orders of magnitude over that. Again, lots of approaches can be done to improve that. I think the key takeaway is that eye tracking is not solved yet for consumer applications. For some high-value applications, if you're disabled, yes, it works. But if you just want to put it on and have it work, it still needs work. So I'm advising a company called Lemnis Technologies. They're working on a Vergence accommodation solution along with eye tracking. And also a company called Cura Technologies that's working on an optical design for AR headsets. I'll stay around afterward if people have questions, or if the actual users of eye tracking want to tell me what they're doing. I'd love to hear. Thank you.
All right, we have some time for questions, but first, a few quick announcements. Again, the exhibit showcase is open tonight from now till 8 p.m. There's also the Women in Vision reception going from 6 to 6:30, so if you have to leave for that, we understand. The Edge AI collaborative reception is also 6 to 6:30 tonight. Tomorrow, the keynote speaker starts again at 9 o'clock. So thank you for coming, and we'll open up for questions. Please come up to the microphone here so that everyone can hear the questions. And for measuring the, let me start off. Measuring the involuntary motion, which you say happens very quickly. How high a frame rate do you need to really capture that accurately?
So saccades typically go up to I use 1,000 degrees a second. So if and the speed depends on how far you're going to saccade. So you can do something useful. They tend to be fairly repeatable with maybe 100 frames a second because you can predict based on some initial measurements. If you actually want to measure it in detail, of course, you want to measure at higher speed than that.
I have seen some applications in the medical field, again, where they actually correlate involuntary eye motion saccades with certain diseases. And have you seen research on?
Yeah. So actually,
degenerative diseases.
So actually, as a diagnostic, eye motions can be used in a variety of ways. So normally, when I saccade from here to there, my eye lands pretty close to my target. But some disease types, people consistently overshoot and then correct, or undershoot with their saccades and correct. And when we're just collecting training data, we had some examples of very clear people with, I think it's called dysmetria. And that's just it's not a disease itself, it's a sign that they might have a disease. And I think Parkinson's might have been one of those.
Question?
Do you know of any examples of people using eye tracking for user interface, like interactions? Kind of?
So we put at iFluence, we put a lot of work into developing user interfaces around eye tracking. And we came up with some new approaches that use saccades rather than dwell, where you sit and stare at a button until it activates, or wink and blink. Both dwell and wink and blink are very tiring to use, and they're not really natural motions, whereas your eye is saccading all the time. I think if you search online, there's some slightly obfuscated demos that show what we developed. Search for iFluence and video, or iFluence and eye tracking or something.
Would you be able to, like if I emailed you, would you be able to send me more?
Yeah, certainly. And as well, of course, Toby is using for assistive technology for people who are in wheelchairs. They've developed a complete system around that.
Yeah, I was more interested in like AR use cases, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So if you use the eye direction for pointing, what do you use for clicking?
So we developed some really cool ways using saccades.
Okay.
There's a lot of information in the pupils too.
Yeah, it varies. It varies. So he said there's a lot of information in the pupils, but that varies a lot as you age, though, how much information there is. Yeah.
So you said eye tracking is not ready for head-mounted displays. So what's missing, or when do you think it's ready?
So on the deep learning side, if you're running roughly the same things as some of the image recognition type algorithms, you saw the layout of the network, and that's of the order of a teraop or so. So in a battery-powered device, that's a lot of power. And then on top of that, collecting enough training data. So I don't know how many people here have had to deal with GDPR data regulations. And in general, in today's world, collecting data from people that is personally identifiable information it's a much more difficult effort than in the past. The paper that I mentioned in the talk, they showed the change in accuracy with the number of subjects that they'd collected, and it just kept improving as they collected more subjects. And we had that experience too. It's you need a lot of data, and we were paying maybe $50 a subject for people to come in, and they have to come in. You have to collect the data. If you can get it done with a cell phone in a gamified way, maybe you can do it for free. If you have a lot of headsets in the field already, maybe you could collect data from those people, but they'd have to agree to it.
So you think it's just the data and not like...
So
I mean, looking at neural networks, I think you cannot use it on a mobile device. It's going to be too slow, too much delay, too much power, too much...
Yeah, so for geometric algorithms, there's just so many corner cases. And you could say, I'm going to give up's the wrong term. I'm just going to drop my accuracy as far as I can. And so we showed something running on Google Glass, and we were targeting high accuracy. But my claim was that if we could do reliable eye tracking that could tell whether you were looking left or looking right, you could make an amazing user interface around that, as long as it was reliable. And so I use the term robust. So that means a user has to be able to put it on and have it work as designed, whatever accuracy you've said. If you've said it's going to be always 5 degrees or better, then it'll be always 5 degrees or better, whether I put it on me, or if I put it on Tom, or if I put it on someone else. For a consumer product, it doesn't have to be 100% of the target audience, but if it's 80%, it's not enough. And if it's somewhere 95, 98, 95 if there's early adopters, somewhere around that, you can probably do it. And I'm not aware that there's robust eye tracking that matches that today. Toby's pretty good, and Lemnis is working on some that's getting better.
Well, one good system for it today is the cost.
Mm-hmm. So mixed in with all that, because of their low volume, they have to be high cost in order for the company to survive. And today, I keep mentioning Tobii because so the other big company that was bought was SMI, that was acquired by Apple, and iFluence was acquired by Google. And Tobii is working independently still, but most of their revenue is from products that use eye tracking, not from eye tracking technology itself. Any more questions?
We use eye tracking for pointing a surgical endoscope. So the surgeon can sit there and watch the monitor, click a button, and move like that, and the camera will follow his eyes.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. I like that.
So it will go in and out, and the camera will move in and out.
Mm-hmm. So one of the advantages of an application like that is you've got a trained user. And it's a really...
We were talking about calibrating. We project different spots, and the user first calibrates, and then they store that data every time they sit down. The chair is placed so that they can't move.
So ideally, you have a system that lets the chair move as well.
Robert, can you come up to the microphone to spend a few minutes telling what you've done with eye tracking it?
I would say one of the things we're doing is developing, for example, right now we're developing a system called Gateway, and we have a different number of designs. So we use eye tracking to see if our crew can use the design without looking like this all the time. We're also tracking our test pilots to see what instruments they're looking at, because some of our new high-speed jets are almost a torture chamber. So we're trying to improve the data supplied to the crew. And I mentioned, probably not everyone heard, is that it's also very useful in our VR simulations, in that you can only need to compute where people are looking at high res, and the rest of it you can go to a lower resolution. And when the pupils get big, there's something wrong. And we're looking at various medical applications, so I think you need to keep an eye out for where the advancement, just mentioned one, the endoscope usage, which I'm all too familiar with. And as you age, you get little floaters in your eyes, which I guess that's your retina coming apart. And you see things that zoom across the room. If they're going slower, you might think that's a blurry mouse or something. But so experiences like that, also, I don't know what value that is, but it's something you'll encounter, I'm sure. But it's far more powerful than you might think.
Thank you.